Two men who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing spider talk, the amazing spider talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the amazing spider talk.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I'm the founder and editor of AmazingSpiderTalk.com, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals.
Ooh, and I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, the founder of the Chasing Amazing blog, author of 100 Things Spider-Man fans should know and do before they die, and I as well own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, but Dan, those annuals, they do not count.
Well, I'll have to take your word for it, Mark. Thanks everybody out there for joining us for the 11th episode of the third season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture.
If you want to learn everything we know about Spidey, why not start by subscribing to our show, Back with the First Season?
You can enjoy our show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or your podcast player of choice. We'd love to have you along for our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future. Just head on over to AmazingSpiderTalk.com for all the details about where to subscribe.
In this third season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk, we've been following our favorite web-slinger through the transition into the Bronze Age, a time period that is known for its darker tone and sometimes outlandish stories. All throughout our third season, we've been discussing the work of artist Ross Andru, one of the main collaborators alongside Jerry Conway on this run, and often overlooked Spider-Man artists.
So we wanted to shine the spotlight on Ross Andru's work to get to know the man with what little information is actually available and take a look at the unique elements he brought to his artwork.
If you enjoy this podcast and want to help us continue while getting amazing bonus content and additional episodes that we never release publicly, go to our show notes and check out our Patreon page and consider joining our team. To that point, we want to issue a special thanks to Timothy Hawk,
Daniel Zoller,
Connor O'Brien,
Stuart Earle,
Cameron,
Jared Weeks,
George Johnston,
and Noah Wilkinson for becoming new patrons and supporting the show's existence. All right, Mark, let's get ready to tour around New York City, guided by the master artist, Ross Andru.
With great powers, with also come great responsibilities. Don't grow forward by trying to kill yourself with your abilities. We're not talking about economics, we're just talking about classic comics today.
Well, Mark, I thought it was appropriate that we spend a whole episode talking about Ross Andru. I'm sure as did you, because Ross Andru is so important to the Bronze Age and Jerry Conway's run during this time, but he often gets overlooked, and I think that's a mistake. You know, it's hard to follow up, runs like Ditko and Romita, and I think, Ross fell very much into the shadow of the two master creators, but he has his own merits all his own. So it's very important, I think, that we start today. And I know he's a favorite of many readers of Spider-Man.
It's kind of funny, like you talk about, how underrated he is. And I think, when we talk a little bit more about who he is as the person, that might actually kind of become more obvious why that's the case. I mean, he was kind of a very quiet, humble person. And I think, maybe by not having as much bombast and outlandishness that maybe some other artists tend to have, it's easy to kind of get lost in the mix a bit. He definitely brought a very distinctive style to Spider-Man. Basically how he name checked a lot of New York City landmarks and making New York City a character. I mean, also just the way he did certain action sequences. I mean, how would you best describe it, Dan?
Well, I think if Ditko brought the weirdness to the comic and Romita brought the romance, Andru kind of blended the two of those together, but grounded it all in realism for the first time. I think he was the right guy for where the book was going, which is that the book was looking to both be outlandish, but also ground it in the, Bronze Age drama that was being brought into the book. And, I think he was a, instrumental part of that. I think for me, he was the first Spider-Man artist to ever give me like vertigo reading a comic book. I feel like his Spider-Man was never on the ground. He was always in the air or way above everybody up in the top of the buildings. That gave it a really distinct visual style. I mean, he put just a back-breaking amount of effort into creating the realism of this comic.
We have some quotes from Jerry Conway from interviews he's given that kind of, I feel, even illustrate this better. But yeah, I mean, certainly talking more broadly here, Andru brought something almost atmospheric to the book that had not been there before. Yeah, I mean, I like calling it realism, or as realistic as, a superhero in spandex who can, has webs and can, move at the speed and the strength of a spider can be realistic. But at the same token, like it just felt, between the fact that like New York was so central to the work that he did as a character, to, like you say, the way he kind of captured Spider-Man in action, it kind of blended these things together. And I feel like, we wouldn't have like the Spider-Man movies the way we have now without like an artist like Andru kind of paving the way on a two-dimensional format, how to make that look, right?
The like visceral thrill that I get playing the Spider-Man game on PlayStation 4 as I'm hurling this guy through the city, it comes from knowing that wherever I shoot a web, it's going to connect onto a building somewhere. And, you look at Romita's Spider-Man and he's very like larger than life superhero, even though it is still the humble Peter Parker. But like, I never got the sense that Romita was really that worried about the mechanics of Spider-Man, and that like, where does his web go when he shoots it and stuff. But like Andru, you get the sense that Spider-Man's in a real place. He can't just jump into the air and take off. Like there is a web that is connecting somewhere. And if there's not somewhere to connect to, Spider-Man's not moving. Like, it was a very kind of real guy. And, I think you're right. Like, the movies would not exist in the same way without his influence. Kind
of going back further, I mean, Ditko to me was kind of, when he captured Spider-Man in motion, I mean, it was like I felt like Ditko really wanted to play up like the fact that he was based off a spider, you know what I mean? Like there was something kind of off-putting and creepy, for lack of a better word, about the way Ditko's Spider-Man moved. Andru embraced the fact that this was a superhero, and as his bio will reveal, I mean, Andru did a lot of work with some of the biggest superheroes of all prior to doing Spider-Man, so it would make sense that he would embrace those elements. But at the same token, like he embraced the visual and the physical dynamic elements that were unique just to Spider-Man. And like, it wasn't just like, carbon copy, man in tights kind of superhero visuals, right?
No, because his Spider-Man was also posed in very weird ways. I mean, I would say less creepy. He's the first guy to do the kind of like thing that Todd McFarlane would become famous for, which is like pushing him into unbendable patterns. Like Andru was certainly more grounded than that, but like there were some moments where Spider-Man would be doing strange and like almost Doctor Strange, like, hand bending stuff in the air. A unique silhouette to a hero fighting crime.
Let's also get a couple little factoids in there. So Ross Andru, he was actually born Roslav Andruskevich. I think I got that right. I've not been practicing my Russian, Dan. I'm sorry. He actually started working professionally in comics in 1948. He did the Tarzan newspaper strip. Now Tarzan, like that's talk about swinging. I mean that, so we get where we got to start there. And then shortly thereafter, he actually started working with his friend and his longtime inker, Mike Esposito, who basically inked almost every issue that Andru did on Spider-Man. I mean, Esposito more or less followed Andru from book to book. They were kind of a package deal. I guess think of it like Ron Frenz and Brett Breeding, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's even a great episode of Comic Book Men where the team of like the salespeople on that show try to help Mrs. Esposito auction off Andru and Esposito's work after they passed. An interesting memorial episode if you're a fan of that show.
He did end up joining the Distinguished Competition in the 1950s, and he did a bunch of comics, but he had his primary stint on Wonder Woman for about 9 years, and then he actually finished out his first run at DC doing The Flash. I don't know, for whatever reason, I always kind of, even though they're really not similar to each other, I always kind of associate the Flash and Spider-Man as similar kind of superheroes. So to me, it makes sense to go from the Flash to Spider-Man. I don't know. Is that am I reaching for that, Dan?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think a lot of people have even complimented the new Flash TV show, or new-ish Flash TV show, for being a sort of like Spider-Man analog or Spider-Man formula. I don't think that's too far off of a run. But nevertheless, he would draw Spider-Man. He did a fill-in issue for John Romita in 1968 that was actually never published in Amazing Spider-Man, but instead was published later in Marvel Superheroes number 14. And, you know, it's straight out of an Amazing Spider-Man comic. It's a story called The Reprehensible Riddle of the Sorcerer. And it introduced this new Magia villain who died in the same story that you'll never hear of ever again, unless someone like Nick Spencer digs it out of obscurity. I mean, if you are curious enough to check out the first Andru work, you can go read that comic and see his first Spider-Man.
At this point, Andru is quite the veteran of the industry, which is kind of interesting. And Jerry would talk about this in some of the interviews he did. So when he joined Amazing Spider-Man in 1973, I mean, he was more than twice Jerry Conway's age. And I think that kind of actually lended a bit of a very interesting kind of mentory type of relationship there, which, I mean, Jerry also, when in our interview with him last season, he indicated he got from John Romita as well. So Jerry's always been very blessed, I think, to work with some very sage-like artists in his time with Amazing Spider-Man, for sure.
You know, alongside Jerry Conway, they created a lot of like great comics and even a ton of characters. Andru gets some credit for co-creating The Punisher, even though that was really a John Romita visual creation, with Jerry providing some of the schematics initially. But he did also create like Rocket Racer and the Big Wheel, and even like Jigsaw, who, you know, you think of as a Daredevil villain, but really his first appearance was here in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man.
You know, on top of that, like, I mean, he got to work in some of the I shouldn't say the original X-Men, but the all new X-Men, like Nightcrawler shows up during his run, kind of early. It's like an early appearance of Nightcrawler, and then, like, you know, we did an episode earlier this season where we kind of poke fun at the Bronze Age villains and some of their absurdities, but like at the same token, like, these are very visually unique creations, people like Cyclone and the Grizzly and Mindworm, and these are all Andru creations. I mean, like, he, you know, for someone that we talked about a few minutes ago being grounded in realism, I mean, these villains are kind of out there, and he clearly had some fun in creating them.
You know, either way, like, these villains, I think a lot of them just come from kind of like a silly place inside of Jerry Conway's mind. But like, even look at like you know, Mindworm, for example. Like, this is a guy that's grounded as well. Like, he may look crazy, but he's wearing like board shorts, you know, in the way that Ross Andru drew him. You know, like, he's just kind of a beach bum. And that, I think, is kind of like an interesting stamp of Andru's on some of these characters. Yeah.
You know, we haven't really talked about this issue a bunch over the years on this show, Dan, but, you know, arguably one of the most famous moments in comics that Andru was a part of was the Superman versus the Amazing Spider-Man crossover one-shot comic from 1976. I mean, now, this was the very first intercompany crossover. I mean, like, this was dogs and cats together, you know, calamity, chaos ensuing. You know, Jerry Conway in subsequent interviews talked about, you know, basically being Ross's masterpiece. Now, Jerry Conway scripted the book. Ross got so much credit for doing was kind of towing the line. I mean, we had these two very distinct, iconic heroes in Superman and Spider-Man that needed to work together in one story. And in addition to like giving them both these like visual moments, like Superman is obviously he's a you know, a pre-World War II hero. Spider-Man is more modern, and yet they visually worked together throughout the whole thing. Like, neither one looked out of place in this comic book, and that is all due to how Andru rendered and manipulated this book to make it look like it was a natural fit, a natural crossover, that you know, that nobody was out of place.
Plus, it features one of his trademarks, which is the Empire State Building being featured on the cover as the two kind of duke it out on top of the building. An interesting factoid that I discovered when researching Andru is that, during his time on the book, and this is something you can kind of look into if you're curious, Marvel had started this kind of quickly ended initiative that had, Andru drawing 2 pages of art on one original artboard. So he kind of has this unique, weird thing. If you look at his pages, where you can see in some of the double page spreads in issues 131, 133 to 136, and 139, that they used 1 page of art to do 2 pages in the comic. And it was meant to cut costs, but it didn't change the bottom line. So Marvel canceled this initiative, but it meant that Andru had to kind of work on the books being paid less. And so, you can still see the level of detail in all of the splashes. And it's like, here's a guy that's really taken one for the team and still putting his all into it despite being kind of treated poorly by Marvel.
On the lighter side, Andru did a number of the Hostess fruit pie ads. I did not know this. You dug this one out, Dan. That's fantastic.
Yeah, the most famous one being one from Daredevil number 121, which features Spider-Man webbing up a bunch of villains to get their fruit pies, the Hostess fruit pies that would become so famous over the years and even were featured in Spider-Verse, the big crossover there. So it's funny that it was Andru's work that they were pulling from.
Another little interesting note, there is a letter in Amazing Spider-Man number 166 from none other than Frank Miller, who, before he, started talking about dystopian conspiracies, he wanted to commend Andru for being, quote unquote, the most conscientious Spider-Man artist.
Yeah, and this is all the way back when he was 19 or 20 years old. So it's always fun to look back through those issues and see really famous creators kind of writing in to commend people that inspired them. And so I wouldn't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Andru was an inspiration on Miller in some way, enough that he wrote a letter in to commend him for being the most conscientious Spider-Man artist, whatever that means.
And then also a lot of Andru's work ended up being used on the Electric Company show, another topic that we covered earlier this season.
Yeah. And then, Mark, what would he do after his time at Marvel?
Well, he did eventually go back in the late 70s to DC, and that's where he served as an editor. And actually, he ended up mentoring a young Alex Saviuk, working on The Flash, back on The Flash again. That's where Alex obviously got a lot of his artistic inspiration from, and then, of course, Alex would go on to illustrate Spider-Man in ASM and in Web of, and then also the daily comic strip, the daily newspaper strip that we talked about earlier. So everything coming full circle for season 3, Dan.
Jerry has talked about Andru's work a number of times, as you mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit about what Jerry said about Andru in some of the interviews that you read?
We had Jerry on so much over the last couple of seasons. We could have gotten him to come back to say this stuff a second time, but let's just quote it from other interviews. He referred to Andru as being more of a writing partner. I mean, he talked about that age difference and kind of Andru's experience, but he also referred to Andru as being kind of very quiet and humble and polite and just kind of a true professional to work with. And it sounded like he and Jerry, they would sit down over coffee and hash out plots and kind of like the old Stan and JR stuff. Stan would just kind of talk through stuff out loud, and then Andru would take the notes and turn it into a story, and it would just be exactly what Jerry was talking about. I mean, that old Marvel House style, I guess it just kind of finds a way to work from generation to generation. One of the things that Jerry also talked about a lot was, and what we talked about earlier in this episode, was the physics of Ross Andru Spider-Man. He talked about it in terms of how Ross used height and distance and perspective. And then also he talked about, and I like the phraseology of this, the centrifugal force of web slinging. And I think that's the best way to put it, right? Because that's really what it is. It's like you said, you get the sense of someone actually shooting a web and then having to swing from that web, which you just didn't quite get the physics of that from earlier iterations of Spider-Man.
I also really like how Ross Andru would create like three-dimensionality in his work. I mean, it seems really obvious in the way that he draws buildings and renders perspectives, but even just layering Spider-Man over multiple layers of art or lines would cause the villains in Spider-Man to kind of pop out of the pages and in a way that I don't think that Romita and Ditko are thinking about all the time, like this kind of three-dimensionality. Their styles were more like, typical cartoon style. Reading through Andrew's stuff, like he really knows how to force perspective to make the characters jump out. And I found that like always fascinating. His work just seems like there's a whole world inside the page of each comic.
The other big thing, and we've talked about this a lot over the course of this episode so far, was the fact that Ross was very specific about getting New York City as a character into these comics as much as possible. And when you go back to earlier Amazing Spider-Man, certainly there was, the Statue of Liberty and other major icons would kind of pop up from time to time. To me, they kind of felt almost obligatory, like just a total name check of like, oh yeah, we're in New York. Here's the Empire State Building. Here's the Statue of Liberty. I mean, but like the way that Andru kind of brings it in is a lot more elegant and organic, in my opinion. Like, you would just be, and we'll get into detail in a few minutes here, but like, you would just kind of be, perusing the panels, and then all of a sudden you would see a major iconic landmark from New York City just in the midst there, not even like trying to be as a major plot beat. I mean, there were some that were used as major plot beats, but there's some they were just kind of integrated so nonchalantly that it was kind of a wonder to see it as a New Yorker. So the way Jerry actually put it in one of his interviews was that he felt that he was the first Spider-Man artist to make Spidey's New York reflect the actual city of New York physically. Jerry and Ross, kind of were admittedly both big fans of New York City itself. They were both residents here. So that was, I think for Jerry, it almost became a bit of a game to how many times he can get references, get Ross to put a reference in visually into his work.
And Ross would just go around New York taking pictures and then using that to straight draw, into the comics, these things. So he was planning it out in a way that like few other artists I think ever have. And I think it's unlikely to see these days. I mean, now everybody can just go online and look up images, and a lot of our artists that are doing these books don't live in New York anymore. But here was a New Yorker traveling around New York, taking pictures of places to match them up perfectly in the books. And there are several forums online that, if you're so interested, that try to get, it's like almost like a geocaching or whatever, where people go around New York and try to match up a photo exactly to what Andru was doing, where he was standing when he decided to draw, different panels in the book. And it's quite remarkable because it is 1-to-1 exact. And even stuff that's less iconic than, say, like the Empire State Building, there'll just be a street corner in a page of Amazing Spider-Man that didn't need to be a reference, but it'll be like some exact street corner from New York. And you're like, okay, I guess that's a real place. And that was the real thing. It made it feel like a real place.
It wasn't just generic warehouses and skyscrapers. And that's not to put down Ditko or Romita, who are both fantastic artists, but like the level of detail and the attention to detail and the passion to really bring out the true grit of New York, it just can't be understated.
Of course, there's, like we just said, all the New York locations, right? Marvel is the world outside your window, and Ross Andru is the man outside your window drawing it. You're right. He has a bunch of other things that he was doing to kind of set himself aside. My favorite of which being that he's like one of the first guys to really kind of popularize, I think, the multiple drawings of Spider-Man on one page to show his movement through an environment. Like, he would do this a lot.
Yeah, it was like Spider-Man in like 3 or 4 different poses, but like kind of like not is it considered silhouetted? I mean, how would you describe the effect? It's like the
translucent, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's to capture that motion. I mean, I think my favorite is the Tarantula Fight from the original Clone Saga that we had talked about a few episodes ago. I mean, Andru does it a lot, but to me, that's one of the more distinct ones. Now, obviously, if you want to talk about major visual iconic moments, of course, and we talked about this earlier this season, there is the kiss between Peter and Mary Jane, which of course was also at JFK Airport. And like that terminal, like, I mean, like he captures the terminal down to the detail. You got planes out on the runway behind them. I mean, like a lot of detail beyond just this very iconic image of Peter and MJ kissing and creating the villain we know as Kindred.
Speaking of like,
I said, you let that one go, Dan.
That's it, everybody. Well, put a pin on that one. While we're talking about that kiss, I think it's important to kind of like, I'd love to talk about very briefly his Spider-Man and Peter Parker and how he drew those characters. Like, to me, his Spider-Man was like kind of where you want the character to be. It's like both lithe and muscular at the same time and able to pose in all of these contorted ways. And his Peter was like handsome, but still like tortured, like especially in the way that he drew Peter's eyes. I mean, there are a number of issues that Andru drew where Peter looks like he's like a demon here. He's like haunted by something, he could draw really like tormented faces, this Ross Andru guy.
Yeah, which is kind of funny that you mentioned that because like in one of the Jerry interviews, he did say like one of the criticisms that Ross would get was that some people would sometimes write into Marvel complaining about his faces. I agree with you. I feel that they were very expressive, but maybe it was just a little too real for some. I don't know. Like to see after having so much, like you say, glamour from Romita all those years, I guess having something with a little more grit to it, like Andru, was a bit of a shock for some.
The issue where, Ross Andru did the cover where Peter was supposed to graduate from ESU and he ultimately doesn't because of like a PE credit that he didn't have. The cover of it has like that. It's almost like ASM number 50 where Spider-Man's silhouette is looking over Peter as he's graduating. I think this is kind of like, to the face credit, Ross Andru had drawn the Spider-Man there on the cover, but it looked like it was grimacing at Peter. And so Marvel called up Romita to kind of redraw the cover. And so if you look at that cover, it's a Romita masked Spider-Man because Romita literally redid the cover for Andru. And I feel like his Spider-Man in mask was always a unique thing. The face didn't always match up, and he was often grimacing looking, or he was always kind of like haggard in some way. And that's what really set it apart for me. But I think they decided on that cover, it ultimately looked too menacing for what was supposed to be a happy moment.
So do we want to get to our tour of New York, or are there any other big Ross moments that you want to talk about?
No, I think the biggest Ross moment of them all is how Ross guided us through New York City through the pages of his comics. So, here we go. We're going to take a tour of New York as guided by Ross Andru. But I have to say this before, I even get into it. You're a resident of New York, and I lived there for 5 years. When I first came to New York, like I found my way around, I think, using Ross Andru. Like my introduction to the city and why I wanted to move there, I think, was because of how I had seen it rendered in the pages of these comics. And I don't think anybody quite brought it to life like Ross Andru. And a number of we're each going to choose 5 of our favorite references that he did. But for me, it's like these are all ones that like, it was Andru that like basically introduced me to all of these places.
I don't know if I would go that far from my own experience, but like I think we talk a lot about New York as a character, and I mean I've said it like 11 times in this episode already. I'm just going to say it again. But like I truly, when I think of those visual moments, when I to make a statement like that, I'm almost always thinking of the Ross Andru run with Cherry and then later with Len Wein. It's kind of like what demonstrates that. I mean, it's this idea that like, I feel like with most artists before and to a certain extent after, although I felt like Andru certainly afterwards gave artists more permission to visually capture the city the way he did. But I just feel like New York, it could have just have been Metropolis or Gotham. There was something kind of general and generic about it, and fictitious, for lack of a better word. And Andru really made New York pop off the page, and preparation for this episode, Dan, I went back through all these issues again and tried to find as many references as I could, and I'm sure I missed a ton because there's just there's just so much, and like you said, there are random street corners that probably don't even look that way anymore. So I wouldn't even know what I'm looking at, but like there was also plenty of landmarks like not just like you said, the big stuff that you automatically assume as part of New York, like, oh, it's the Empire State Building, it's the Statue of Liberty, it's the Brooklyn Bridge, but like these little visual buildings where I when I was looking on the page, I'm like, wait, I know that. Where is that? And then I was like actually like then working on Google being like, that's what it is. Because it's like, I know I walk by that building. It's just it's a delight to kind of, this was a delight to put together this little list, if you will. I mean, I don't know. Do we want to put some of these references in the show notes maybe? Would that be something fun? So it's not completely a wash?
I think we should do that. I'm smelling an article coming, Mark.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. You have like a list of like 26 here, and you're right. I think it's just scratching the surface. We're going to talk about 10 of these, and that's not even scratching the surface of our list.
Why don't we go chronologically? And I think the first one is actually from you, Dan. So why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, this is from Amazing Spider-Man number 134. This is an issue that I like a lot. It's an issue involving the tarantula where, Peter goes on this kind of like tour around the harbor on a boat out of the Chelsea Piers, which is what we see, Andrew depicting here. And that's really fun. And this also happens to be the one where MJ is dating Brad Davis, the quarterback that is never mentioned ever again, and yet inexplicably found his way into becoming a major character in Spider-Man Far From Home. This is a fun issue for me because like Tarantula basically takes over the boat that they're on, and Spider-Man has to use the kind of like features of the west side of Manhattan to kind of swing on and off the boat to defeat Tarantula, and you really get a sense of the space and the vulnerability of Spider-Man in this. And Andrew, puts it really amazingly. And I think Andrew had a ton of fun drawing Tarantula. I think it's the best depiction of this character. And this is a fun one for me. So that's Amazing Spider-Man number 134.
It's funny that you said that with Tarantula because, Jerry Conway obviously has talked many times over the years about the fondness he has for Tarantula and kind of now putting all the pieces together in terms of Jerry's fondness for Ross Andru as a collaborator and just the amount of fun Andrew clearly had illustrating Tarantula. You got to wonder if that's maybe where all this mutual fondness is coming from, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a cool setup. It's the kind of issue we don't get anymore, which is like let's exploit one unique thing about New York and set a story around it, right? Which is like, what do you do when you're stuck on a harbor cruise and a villain takes it over like a terrorist? We don't really get those kind of like stuck in the subway stuff anymore. And this is a fun kind of yesteryear kind of story.
My first reference is from Amazing Spider-Man number 136, which is more famously the first Harry Osborn as Green Goblin Spider-Man fight. But there is this very kind of lovely little sequence early in the issue where Peter and MJ are out on a date. They're strolling like young lovers do. Young lovers, one getting over the tragic death of his earlier girlfriend. And like they're kind of like they're licking an ice cream cone and they're walking here and there, and then like just in the background, look very nonchalantly but beautifully rendered, is St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is just this hugely ornate building in Midtown Manhattan. And like it's so striking to me. Like to me, this is Ross Andru and how he integrated the city in a nutshell. It's like, he didn't have to put St. Patrick's Cathedral into this scene. It could have just been a random coffee shop or just some random brownstone or whatever that from or an apartment building from New York City. And instead, he took like this very ornate, detailed, architecturally masterful building and put it right smack in the middle of this panel, and then in the very next panel it's gone. So like like that panel could probably serve as like a work of art for someone that loves St. Patrick's Cathedral and loves Spider-Man and wanted to have them all together, but instead it's just kind of there and gone, kind of the way it is when you live in New York City. Because like when you live here every day and or go to work every day, you walk by stuff that is historically or culturally significant, and you kind of start taking it for granted. And that's to me kind of what I feel we have here. It's this, oh, there's St. Patrick's, and now all of a sudden Harry Osborn's throwing pumpkin bombs, and we got to do stuff.
It's the old adage of you can tell the tourists because they're the ones that are still looking up.
Right, exactly.
So speaking of which, and looking up, what about your next one?
The next one, I mean, this is even quicker glance and you'll miss it kind of a thing. But I love that element of it, which is from Amazing Spider-Man number 138, which is one of the Spider-Man versus the Grizzly issues, very famous issue. Spider-Man is web slinging around trying to hunt down the Grizzly after he attacked J. Jonah Jameson, and he just whizzes by the side of the Chrysler Building. Now the Chrysler Building, I mean, to me, the Empire State Building is the taller of these two skyscrapers that have the big pointy needles in New York City. But the Chrysler Building is probably the more visually interesting one, especially the side panels of it, that glass kind of almost like diamond-esque facade of it. And similar to what I said about St. Patrick's, to me it's amazing that the visual is Spider-Man is web slinging. Like that alone is where the action is. You don't necessarily need to bring anything else to that panel to make it any more or less dramatic. And the fact that like Andrew just very kind of quietly, not even the whole Chrysler Building, but just like one corner of it into the panel. Again, when I was going through these comics to prepare for this issue, I almost missed it the first time, and I had to go back. I was like, wait a second, that's the Chrysler Building, and I had no idea that that's how he would work that in, and I just thought that was brilliant. That's
so cool. So you have another one here chronologically. This one's really personal to you.
Yeah, okay. So, and we talked about this, I think, when we talked about the Clone Saga as well, so if I'm repeating anything, I apologize. But yes, issue 149, the big epic final battle where Ned Leeds is tied up by the Jackal and Spider-Man is fighting himself. What's the title of it? It's Even If I Win, I Die,
yeah.
But the battle takes place at the home of, or the former home of my precious New York Mets, Shea Stadium, and then the whole thing gets blown to bits at the end, and yet the Mets just kept playing there, regrettably, especially in the 70s. They were so bad in the 70s days. So,
some would say they never fully repaired that stadium.
They never truly did. I mean, until the 80s when they would bring it down for real. But like I just loved, again, kind of staying true to the canon that is Peter Parker is a Met fan. And don't you ever forget it. I think there were a couple of people who tried to put him in a Yankee hat once, and that's just ridiculous. I love that, the Queens boy had to do a big battle against himself at the Queens baseball stadium. So I just had to shout that out.
It's just natural. Well, speaking of natural, we're going to move on to the next one, which is Amazing Spider-Man number 166. And Mark, this holds a special place between you and I, which is that like our relationship was formed on the back of this issue, which we had even a Christmas special on this issue a few years ago. And it is the one where Spider-Man fights Stegron, the dinosaur man, at the Museum of Natural History, and specifically the dinosaur exhibit. And I gotta think that Andrew just wandered around this building taking pictures of all the rooms and exhibits, etc., to bring this thing to life, because it is like photo accurate. No matter how insane the comic itself is, enough to have me bug you every week to write an article about it, for those who have followed us for that long of a time. He renders it in realism, and it even expands into Central Park, where we get the kind of classic bridges of Central Park, which ultimately Stegron slips into the ice in dramatic style, frozen in time, never to be seen ever again. That's not true, but that moment is a haunting one, which I believe Stegron joined us on the show to reenact at some point. Yeah, Amazing Spider-Man number 166, a all-time classic, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
Don't let Mother tell you otherwise. Right?
No.
I feel like I'm sucking all the air out of the room here, but it's just, again, the chronological. I just want to throw out Amazing Spider-Man number 167. There's actually a ton of cues, and we should totally tie 167 together with 168, similar to the Stegron issues. So these are the first Will-O-the-Wisp stories. We get some some Madison Square Garden, St. Patrick's Cathedral again, but then, there's this big fight in the first issue that spills over to the next between Spider-Man and Will-O-Wisp, where they go to 30 Rockefeller Plaza, aka 30 Rock, which is where they shoot Saturday Night Live, among other things. And by the way, around this time, Marvel actually had a good relationship with the cast of Saturday Night Live. There was that whole Marvel team up where Spider-Man teamed up with the not ready for primetime players. So, I mean, I almost wonder if that was part of what got that worked in at this point. They fought on the very famous Rockefeller Center ice skating rink where the Christmas tree gets set up every year. And again, being in New York, that's such a visually iconic place. It's a meeting place. It's a mecca for a lot of people. People every year want to go to that rink, to the rink to see the tree, to do this. So just kind of seeing it laid out there, but not as a little romantic, it wasn't Peter and MJ ice skating, but it's Spider-Man fighting this kind of odd villain. I just thought that was really interesting use of how to work that in, and I don't think I had seen Rockefeller Center in prior to that, so I just had to tip my hat to that integration of that.
Well, the next one I'm going to do is one that's constantly featured in Amazing Spider-Man, as the meeting place of Spider-Man and the Human Torch. That's in Amazing Spider-Man number 175. There's a battle on the Statue of Liberty, well, on the cover, and inside, I believe it's the one where Hitman and his kind of bunch of stooges or whatever are fighting Spider-Man on that statue. And it's, it's an odd use of that space because, boy, how are you going to catch that barge to get out there to then get up on the statue and fight someone? It's pretty elaborate. There's also the Brooklyn Bridge on the inside, which is definitively the Brooklyn Bridge this time.
Yes,
it's not any other bridge. But so that's another really cool issue. And I like, the Statue of Liberty is overused in terms of how it's integrated in movies. But in comics, this is a fun use of it for a kind of mob battle.
And also they use the inside of the crown and stuff like they, even in something that's get used a lot, it's used differently and in a creative way here, I think, which is worth noting.
Right. All of the bad guys have to cram themselves inside of a very small walk space. These stairs, they're killing me. Also, I wanted to shout out to Amazing Spider-Man number 179, which I think this one's really cool how it's done because this is the fight with the third Green Goblin, Bart Hamilton, I believe. So this is Spider-Man fighting Bart Hamilton, but at the Radio City Music Hall. So you get the marquee, but then it goes in and outside of the music hall. And even the Spider-Man, the animated series from the 90s would kind of borrow from this visual and do a big Hobgoblin scene there. I believe Venom as well. So there would be this big Radio City Music Hall thing. But you really get the sense of the kind of threat of the airborne menace in this issue because these two guys are fighting over crowds of people below them in this kind of very packed, crowded space. And it's a great integration of a New York City location into the comic book.
The last one from me that I'm going to mention is from Amazing Spider-Man number 182. And the reason why I wanted to mention this was because this was one of those instances where I saw the visual and I knew it was something famous. I knew it was something I've seen a bunch of times in my life, and I couldn't quite pick up on what and where it was until I did some research and found out it's actually, you see Rocket Racer coming out down the street through an arch. And the arch is the facade of the municipal building, which is down by Chambers Street or by the courthouse down in Lower Manhattan. And that's the thing. I'm looking at this and it's this very architecturally classical looking archway. And I'm well, it's not Washington Square because I know what that looks like. And then I was wondering, wait, is that the arch that is down by the Manhattan Bridge by Chinatown going into Brooklyn? And it's nope, it's not that either. So what am I looking at here? And then, like I said, the other famous arch. It's like, how many famous arches are in New York? Apparently more than just those two. So I just like that one got worked in, and then the Sea Rocket Racer kind of, shooting out of it on his skateboard was pretty cool too.
Rocket Racer is such a Ross Andru villain, if you will, if you want to call him a villain, because he really takes advantage of what Ross Andru likes to do, which is the kind of like vertigo of being on the sides of buildings. I mean, those drawings are always so fascinating to me, to see him, and Ross Andru utilizing the kind of like fire trail of the Rocket Racer. So you get these like hard right angles as he's kind of like angling his way around the surface of buildings. I always thought he was a cool looking villain as done by Andru. So my final one is going to be not from Amazing Spider-Man, but from Giant Size Spider-Man #2, which is actually written by Len Wein, not Jerry Conway. And this one is it's a Giant Size Spider-Man and Master of Kung Fu Shang-Chi, soon to be featured in an MCU movie. The book starts off with Spider-Man fighting against the White Dragon and his goons outside of the Guggenheim building. And this was the first time I think that I ever was aware of the weirdness of the Guggenheim as a kid, like the strange curved outside of that building. And, Andru renders it perfectly here. And it's such a great place for like a Spider-Man fight and robbery, is this kind of very architecturally strange building like the Guggenheim, which stands out in New York. I thought that was very cool and worth mentioning, that not everything was so rigid and right angly with Ross Andru. He really could do the strange, stuff as well.
The Guggenheim is certainly not an easy thing to visually capture, and that scene says it all. I've not seen that comic prior to this, so that's a pretty cool find, Dan.
Mark, that's our tour through New York. Get off the tour bus and come back down to planet Earth, everybody. Ross Andru. Maybe we shouldn't be coming back down to planet Earth, since we're talking about Ross Andru here. We should be soaring through the skies. I think in terms of legends, that's where Ross Andru kind of fits for us, which is he is one of the soaring Spider-Man artists.
Well, thanks for joining us for our 11th episode of our 3rd season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. Dan, what's coming down the pike next for our show?
Yeah, just in time for the final issue to be released, we're going to be releasing part 1 of our Absolute Carnage reviews. I've kind of released issue #1 already, just as a tease for people, but if you missed that or you want to get it caught up again, where this part 1 of Review Roundup, it's going to cover issue 1 and issue 2 of Absolute Carnage with guests Alan Churchill and Xavier Mendoza from the Godzilla Mendoza YouTube page. So if you're a fan of his on YouTube, he's going to be joining our show for the first time.
Also, for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast feed this week for a special review of Amazing Spider-Man #33. There's no better place to join on the Patreon bandwagon than to join us for our exciting coverage of the Nick Spencer run and the mega event Absolute Carnage. Remember, for just $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll get access to our exclusive new issue reviews, B-book reviews, extended interviews, mailbags, and more. And for $10 or more a month, you'll get access to some awesome commissioned artwork this season from Barry Kitson.
Also, be sure to check out our sister show, The Untold Talks to Spider-Man. Plus, we've also got the amazing Spider Slack community for you to join. Just check out this episode's description for a link to join our Spider-Man Talkin' community. And a special thank you to Rick Coste, our amazing, spectacular, adjectiveless web of editor who cut together this very episode. Rick, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and where we can find your work?
Thanks, Dan. This is Rick, and you can find my work at modernaudiodrama.com. You can also go to rickcoste.com, and there's links to my audio shows, audio fiction, the superhero audio drama Inhale, as well as The Behemoth. You can also follow me on Twitter at Rick Coste. That's RickCoste. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks again, Rick. And Mark, where can we find you online this week?
Of course, you can find me on Twitter at ChasingASMblog. You can always find my book. It's a great holiday gift, 100 Things Spider-Man fans should know and do before they die, wherever books are sold. Dan, where can we find you?
I'm the same place, not on your handle, Mark, but I am at @SupSpiderTalk on Twitter. Just come on over and say hi and follow me for all kinds of spider goodness. And maybe one day I will Dr. Octopus my way into Mark's brain and take over his Twitter handle.
Whoa, that's kind of creepy, but That doesn't sound like the responsible thing to do, though, Dan.
Well, one of the things that happened to Dr. Octopus when he switched brains with Peter Parker is that he was suddenly imbued with all of these messages from Peter Parker's life that changed him and made him into the superior Spider-Man. And maybe I will become the superior Mark Giannacchio when I download all of the phrases that I need to remember and mottos that would inform my life. So, Mark, what might I have imprinted on my new brain if I were to swap with you?
Holy cow, that is some intro. Well, Dan, I think the most important thing that you would have downloaded would be to know, with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.
Don't miss the next installment.